What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about some interesting and compelling information that I came across today that I think you guys are going to really want to hear that has a lot of impact on the Detroit Lions as well. So let's get it started. So welcome in, everybody, to another video. And as always, before we get into the video, make sure you go in the description and follow Fan to Fan Network on Twitch. The big takeover is kicking off on July 4th. So many of you guys have heard about the takeover. Some of you guys probably still don't know exactly what it is. If you follow me on Instagram, you probably have a pretty good idea from all the stories that I post. But either way, if you guys are still kind of confused about what really is going on here, well, I'll give you guys a pretty brief summary. So as we know, we are Lions fans, and we are a great fan base, right? We know a lot about our team, and the mainstream really doesn't seem to know what the heck they're talking about most of the time. Most of the time, we just laugh at whatever the heck they say because they're usually wrong and they have no idea what they're talking about, and they don't know our team like we do, and they don't give us the same love and respect that we do for the Detroit Lions, right? They just don't know like we do. And that's the same thing that a lot of other teams deal with. Unfortunately, a lot of other teams deal with that. So for you guys, what we are doing here is it's a fan-to-fan network, right? So it's for you fans to get involved and interact with every single NFL team on another level. The mainstream really doesn't talk about us a lot, and other teams have to deal with this as well. So for this, we're going to have every single NFL team be involved here. Every single NFL team is going to have their own ambassadors that are going to talk about their team, that are going to give you the news on your team, that are going to keep you updated. It's going to make it really easy for you guys to find us. We're going to try to take over this whole thing. And if you guys think it's crazy, then you probably don't want to be a part of it because it is going to be that big. It's going to be that big. So if you guys want to get a part of that, make sure you follow the description on Twitch. Now, if you guys have more questions, you can obviously send me them in the comments or wherever, and I will answer them. But that's just a little brief summary. Now, today's video is very interesting because initially I came into today with this mindset. Okay, I'm going to make a video and I'm going to look at the Detroit Lions and say, okay, well, what if they finish top half in the league in rushing yards? What if the Detroit Lions are top half in the league in rushing yards? Because as we know, under Matthew Stafford, they've never been. What if they were top half in the league in rushing yards? How good would the Lions be? Would that equal playoffs? Would that equal better defense? What would that mean for the Detroit Lions? And that's really a hard thing to do. So it took a lot of research for me initially. However, I came across a lot of different information that I wasn't necessarily expecting to find that changed the way I was looking at things. And I was like, hold up, what am I doing here? This stuff is way too darn basic. I can't be saying stuff like this. This is weak. This is weak. There's way more information I could be getting to you guys. This is just not the right way to look at this. It's too easy for me to say, well, if the Lions are better at running the football, they'd be a better team. Okay, well, that's very bold, right? But can you give us a little bit more than that, right? That's what I need to do. I got to give you guys more than that because that is the goal, is to give you guys some legit information. Like, that's not information. That's not news. Oh, if you have the best rushing team and the best passing team, your offense is going to be good. Well, yes, it will be good. But come on, man. Let's be realistic here. Let's give you guys some information on what this all means. Now, we usually get caught up in rushing yards. I get caught up in rushing yards a lot. Total rushing yards in the end of the season, and that's how we rank the Lions' rushing attack. However, as we have to all know, we all understand this. If you look a little bit deeper, rushing yards can be very deceiving. I mean, rushing yards on their own don't really make a lot of sense. For example, if I and the Detroit Lions offense coordinator, I say, hey, we're hitting 100 yards rushing every single game, no matter what, we will run the ball 50 times until we hit 100 yards rushing. We will do it as many times as it takes. And you hit 100 yards rushing, but you're very inefficient, and you're very ineffective, and you're terrible on offense because that's all you did was run the football. That's not good. Yeah, you had a lot of rushing yards, but you had it at the expense of being a successful and efficient team. So obviously that stat on its own is not very good because if I run 50 times, I have 100 yards, 2 yards per carry is obviously completely terrible. So that's not good. So most people, including myself, would simply look at this and say, okay, well, hold up, let's just look at yards per attempt. Now, for me, I think it's simple. Hey, if you have a good rushing attack, that just seems like kind of the philosophy. But we also understand that quarterbacks are super important, right? We understand how important a quarterback is. And while you can win with not a great quarterback if you have literally everything else, having a good quarterback can be very beneficial because we just pointed out the Lions have made the playoffs 3 times and they've never finished in the top half of rushing. I mean, in 2014, we were 28th in rushing. So you can definitely do it without being successful at rushing the football. You just need other things to go well. You need to do other things well, right? Makes sense. Okay, well, let's look at rushing the football. So this is an interesting stat that I came across that I think you guys would be really intrigued to hear. So go back to the 1997 season through 2017, all of those seasons combined. In those seasons, 57.5% of those teams that had a positive rushing efficiency made the playoffs. 57%, that's not bad. So you're telling me if I have more rushing yards per attempt than my opponent, there's a 57% chance that I'm going to be a playoff team. All right, that sounds pretty good. So maybe we do need to, just make that running game good. However, when you look at this stat, it definitely changes the way you think about things. 39 from 1998 to 2017. That's a lot of years. That's a huge sample size. So it's not a small one. That's a huge sample size. 39 of those 252 playoff teams allowed more yards per completion than they gained. Only 39 of those teams. So basically, you're telling me this. 84.5% of teams that had more yards per completion than their opponent made the playoffs. Now, that seems like a crazy stat. Maybe it seems like a wild stat, but I guess it kind of makes sense when you look at it. I mean, stats are stats. It makes sense because if you have a lot of passing yards, maybe you're just throwing the ball like rushing, you're just throwing the ball a lot. If you have a high completion percentage, maybe you're just not throwing it deep. So it comes down to yards per completion, and 84.5% of the time, if you have more yards per completion than your opponent, you will be a playoff team. Well, that sounds pretty darn good. I like those odds. So let's look at the 3 years the Detroit Lions have made the playoffs, because I need to fact check this because it sounds a little fishy. I need to back this up. Let's do it. Let's start off with 2011, the Detroit Lions' first playoff appearance. 2011, the Lions' defense wasn't very good, but obviously we know they had a great passing attack. So you're thinking that this one would probably back up, and it does. The Detroit Lions allowed 10.9 yards per completion, which was 5th, by the way. Bad defense, but you were 5th. Okay, well, the stats looking pretty darn good already. And you had 12 yards per completion. You made the playoffs. You had a positive passing efficiency. Boom, checks out. 2014. All right, 2014. You had 11.7 yards per completion, which was 14th, and you allowed 10.4 yards per completion, which was 3rd. That checks out. Interesting. Okay. How about 2016, your last playoff appearance? 8 comebacks, 10.4 yards per completion, and you had 11.4 yards per completion. And again, it checks out. So the 3 years you've been in the playoffs, that stat holds true. 100% holds true. All right, well, let's look at it like this because hold up. I don't know the rushing one's necessarily true. How about we look at it the same way with the rushing efficiency? You know, yards per attempt. All right, let's do it. 2011. Let's see if they can back up all 3 years like the passing did. 2011, here we go. The Detroit Lions ran for 4.3 yards per carry, and they allowed 5 yards per carry. All right, that's a negative efficiency, but yet you made the playoffs. It's 27% higher chance that you're going to be a playoff team if you have more yards per attempt, more yards per completion than your opponent, and rather than having more rushing yards per attempt than your opponent. Wow. So it actually comes out true. There's actually stats to back up. And it seems crazy, but there's actually stats to back it up. And obviously there's a few outliers. That's why there is those 39 teams. But for the most part, it's pretty much true that, hey, if you have more yards per completion, then you're going to be good. Now, for the Detroit Lions, this is a good thing. And here's why. And here's exactly why. If you look at 2019 last season, keep in mind they were with a backup quarterback. They were with a backup quarterback for half the season, 2 backup quarterbacks, a second and a third string. Offensively, the Detroit Lions last season were 6th in the league with 12.2 yards per completion. 12.2 yards per completion. Okay, that's interesting. 6th in the league. All right. Now, when you look at them defensively, they allowed 12.4 yards per completion. So once again, it would have checked out. That boom, you had a negative, so you didn't make the playoffs. Now, what's interesting about this is it necessarily doesn't mean you have to have a lot of passing yards per completion. It just means you have to have more passing yards completion than you allow for your opponent. So you could be 31st as long as you allow the least amount of passing yards per completion. Very interesting. I thought that's just a very interesting stat. I mean, it pretty much backs up most of the time. Not all the time. There is still a 16% chance that it's not true. So there is ways that it doesn't happen. Now, how do you do this? How do you get to that point? How can the Lions be good at this? Well, if you look at Lions, like I just said, their offense is good passing-wise, so they're already good there. Now they just need to figure out how to stop teams defensively. And how the Lions doing it, Matt Patricia's philosophy, dropping guys into coverage, stacking the secondary, and working his way up, working his way to the front, to the D-line. Now, it's not just that, hey, that's the great strategy to do it, because every strategy can work. Some teams can do this with a 4 defensive linemen. Some teams can do this by blitzing a lot. Whatever your strategy may be, doesn't change up how you do your scheme. It's simply just as saying that if you have more yards per completion than your opponent, 84.5% of the time, according to all those years, you will be a playoff team. And if the Detroit Lions can have a passing attack like they did last year, where Stafford was taking a lot of yards per attempt, which is interesting that Matthew Stafford had the most yards per attempt of his career with Darrell Bevell, a proven offensive coordinator that has led multiple teams to the playoffs. I'm pretty sure he knows what he's doing. 12.2 yards per completion. All you got to do is get that defense down. And we wouldn't have been on pace for the playoffs. But if Stafford was healthy for all of his games, we would have been on pace for 7-1, just outside the playoff picture, which by numbers makes that pretty darn accurate. Makes it look pretty darn accurate. We have all the years from 1998 to 2017, but I wanted to go back and fact check the last couple of years just to make sure this was somewhat accurate, because if they're accurate percentages-wise from the last couple of years and who made the playoffs, then I know that the other numbers are probably pretty darn accurate. So just to make sure that everything is still relevant, that the last 2 years we've seen a lot of similar things. So let's start off with 2019. Let's look at 2019 and look at those teams. So we're going to be looking at all the playoff teams from the 2019 season to see if those teams had more yards per completion than their opponents. So we looked at averages once again. It came out that 8 of the 12 playoff teams, which is 67% that made the playoffs, had more yards per completions than their opponent. Okay, 67%, a little bit lower than the 80+% that we saw, okay, but it's kind of close. So I went back again and looked at 2018. So I was like, all right, how about 2018? Is it 60 again, or is it more? Because 2018, again, is a number that we don't have, a year that was not included in those years for that percentage. So in 2018, it came back that 10 of the 12 playoff teams had more yards per completion than their opponent. That is 83%. Now that seems about right. So for those 2 years, that seems pretty close. That seems pretty accurate. How about the rushing? So I want to look at 2019 and see the rushing one and see if it's actually that low or if it should be higher. Well, when I looked at the rushing, the results are pretty darn surprising. 58% of the teams, 58%, which was 7 out of the 12 teams, had more rushing yards per attempt than their opponent. And 3 of those were by 0.1 yards. 3 were by 0.1 yards, and it was 58% of the teams. And as we know, the main number, the overall number from the 90s to 2017, the number that we have is 57.5%. So it seems like the numbers are pretty accurate, and they've held up the last 2 years as well. So I think, you know, the rushing game can be important, and for certain teams it can work really well, and I think you can definitely benefit from it. But you also got to make sure they're not just simply looking at rushing yards. And for the Detroit Lions, they can be successful by having a efficient passing attack with yards per completion, and they can also be successful if they can slow down yards per completion, right? Overall, you have to be a good team. You got to be a lot better than you were last year. But I just thought it was a really interesting stat overall, so I really want to share it with you guys. What do you guys think about this? I think I need to make this point clear before we end the video about the title. So it's not that rushing is irrelevant and that having a good, effective rushing attack doesn't mean anything, because it definitely does. Because if you look at a team like the Minnesota Vikings, the reason their passing attack is successful and they're able to go down the field is because they have a good rushing attack. And for a lot of teams, they probably wouldn't be as good at passing the football if they couldn't run the ball. Just like the Tennessee Titans, if they couldn't run the ball really well, they probably wouldn't pass as well as they do. So a rushing attack, an efficient rushing attack, can help there. Well, you still do need to have an effective rushing game, but you can do it without really having an effective rushing game. We've seen it like from the Seattle Seahawks, and obviously the stats kind of back up that you can. But for you to have more yards per completion than your opponent, those things can be opened up by having an effective rushing game. So it's not that rushing football is completely irrelevant. It's that rushing yards, the stat of rushing yards, really on its own doesn't mean that much. So I want to point that out before we end this. Were you expecting to see numbers? I've never seen this before, but it's really interesting to just think about. Let me know your thoughts, comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.